Keep yourself in the loop of everything football on the Golden State Media Concepts Football Podcast. The latest news on and off the field, be it college football, Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC to the NFL. We've got you covered. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Football Podcast.
Welcome into the GSMC Football Podcast, right here on the GSMC Podcast Network. It's your host, Brice Lewis, back again. And guys, I have to let you guys know this will also be the last time I will be doing the football show for GSMC, as I've decided to move on to future endeavors. So, we're going to make this last episode a good one with you guys. Definitely appreciate the journey. Appreciate the opportunity GSMC has given me. And so on and so forth. So, like I said, I just want to let that be known right off the gate. But we're going to have a good show today. And also, listen to my last basketball podcast as well that I have to do. So, all that happens. But yeah, I just want to get that into first, you know what I'm saying. But now, let's go ahead, talk about what we got on today's show. First, we have to talk about Aaron Rodgers. Everybody's been talking about all week since the NFC Championship game loss. Is he really someone who could leave Green Bay? Why is he feeling the way he feels? We're also going to discuss the Rams QB situation, as we have big news coming out of LA and that quarterback situation that's shocking a lot of people around the league. We're going to talk about potentially other news, like the Saints potentially intrigued by starting Jameis Winston next year. We've heard a lot of Taysom Hill this past year. Now they're saying they're intrigued by Jameis. We're going to also talk about teams talking to Stafford, Texans get a head coach, and retirements. So we have all that today on the podcast. So like I said, thank you for tuning into the GSMC Football Podcast. Let's get this in. So, as you know, Green Bay lost to Tampa Bay this past Sunday. And Aaron Rodgers had some very interesting comments after the game, talking about how there's a lot of people up. We don't know what the team's going to look like next year, and that includes me. And so, I mean, if you just look at the clear front view of everything, you don't necessarily, if you look at the situation, think Rodgers will be moved. That's why it kind of caught people by attention. Is he going to force his way out? Is he threatening the team in this situation? I mean, he's under contract for 3 years, so it's not that. It's not they're going to cut him. Would Green Bay be interested in trading him? I don't think that's it either. It wouldn't make any sense just because of the fact that what direction are you trying to go in with the team? And so, really, I think what's going on here is I think obviously, as we know, last draft, Green Bay drafted a quarterback. Their future quarterback. This was clear why they drafted Jordan Love. They traded up to get him too. And that pissed Aaron Rodgers off. I mean, that's just as simple as I can put it. It pissed Aaron Rodgers off. And so, I think that, Aaron, even though he played this season, he had his best year in the system with Matt LaFleur. They got to the NFC Championship game again. I think he's still maybe a little mad about that situation, still not understanding why couldn't we have used that pick maybe on someone who could have helped us this year instead of a guy who didn't even play a snap. I don't even think Jordan Love was active for any games this year. And I think that's what I think I think some people look at, you're drafting somebody in the first round that you basically know is not going to play for us this year. And I mean, if it's one thing if he was backup, because it's like, okay, he's backup. This man wasn't even active. So it's like, it makes you sometimes first question, do y'all even view Jordan Love highly after having him a year in there? Or is that just, like I said, was that the plan before the season started? Clearly, you have a developmental guy like Jordan Love. You don't have an offseason to really develop him. I can maybe get it, especially with a team like Green Bay who is still kind of in a win-now kind of mode. And I think the thing about Green Bay, and I think this is also the issue where I think this rubbed Aaron the wrong way, is with drafting Jordan Love, Aaron Rodgers knows he's getting older. He knows he can still play at elite level. and the team is still a team that can compete. And he may have sat there and said, okay, when you know as a team that you're like able to compete for a championship, you would think the front office and the head coach and everybody on the team is trying to win now. It's only when you see a decline, or it's only when you see that your team is starting to go down where you're like, okay, we may need to make some changes. The thing is with Aaron, I think he felt like we were in that position where we were needing to make changes. We weren't in that position where something needed to change. We were clearly firmly still with our window open, still able to compete for a championship. And you drafting that quarterback it just didn't make sense. Because here's also the issue that the Packers are going to have. Now, they're talking about keeping Aaron Rodgers. They say Aaron Rodgers may want a new contract, which means that could be adding some years. And so this is my question. You drafted Jordan Love, right, to be your potential franchise quarterback in the future, right, after Aaron Rodgers. Well, you do realize, he can stay up to 5 years with Green Bay, which, you would probably expect it maybe. But are you really willing to go into the 4th year with Jordan Love and still say Rodgers is going to be your quarterback? At some point, you're going to be in that New England situation where Belichick was like, okay, I like Jimmy G. I think Jimmy G could be our guy. And so that's why when his last year was coming up, he was like, all right, Brady, I'm ready to let you go because I think I have a guy right here. And we know how that situation went. Robert Kraft kept that from happening. So, that could be the same situation Green Bay could be headed for with Jordan Love. And especially if Rodgers ever does end up missing games or anything of the sort in the next couple of years, and let's say Jordan Love comes in and he looks pretty decent. That's going to be a question that's going to linger around this organization. And, you don't want to get to a point where it's like, hey, we invested a first-round pick in this guy and he hasn't touched the field. We may have to legitimately just move on from Rodgers just to legitimately see if we have our future quarterback or not. And so that also could potentially cause some issues within the organization. And so what Rodgers could be doing by those comments and obviously, everything that's happening. And I think Rodgers came back on the Pat McAfee show and said that he doesn't actually think he's going to leave. He's just saying, you can't just say it's an absolute guarantee he's staying. But I think Green Bay is in a position where you got some decisions to make this offseason. You got some players you got to decide who you're going to keep and leave. Now, I do say this. A lot of people figured when they drafted A.J. Dillon from Boston College, a lot of people were questioning, well, you got Aaron Jones. Well, remember, Aaron Jones is a free agent, and he's going to command a lot of money on the open market. Maybe Green Bay knows. And Green Bay, remember, is not really a team that's a big spending team. Remember, they just let go of their top linebacker, Blake Martinez, this past year because he was going to get make money. And maybe they're looking at a guy like Aaron Jones and know he's important. But they look at A.J. Dillon. A.J. Dillon played well to end the season in a couple of games. The Tennessee game, for example. He was, like I said, he was out there playing in the fourth quarter late in the NFC Championship game. And maybe they're looking at it and saying, okay, we have a cheaper guy in A.J. Dillon we could keep, let Aaron Jones walk. Maybe you're not as special at running back. Defensively, you got some players who could be up as well. But you have talent on the defensive end. I'm sure Rodgers looks at this team and says, okay, we realistically could run it back next year and still be competing for a championship. But the key is, I think, with Rodgers, he needs to see what is this team going to do? What is this team planning? Are you trying to win now or are you trying to build for the future? And I think that's going to be the big question I think Green Bay has to answer this offseason. Are you trying to win now or are you planning for the offseason? Because Rodgers is probably like, I understand that, you want to make sure you got guys for the future. But you could do that and still win now. And I guess, like I said, with that Jordan Love trade, he probably felt like you were low-key telling me, we're going to probably get rid of you in a couple of years. So we're just going to go ahead and draft our quarterback now. And maybe that's why he felt slighted. Now, we don't forget, Rodgers, realistically, we said even last year, can't really be traded without a huge cap hit for at least next year and I think the next year. So at least 2 more years in terms of, unless Green Bay is okay with taking a big cap hit and, dealing with the financial mechanics of that. So Rodgers could legitimately be the quarterback in Green Bay for the next 2 years. And then you got 3 years with Jordan Love in the league. So he's going to be going into his 4th year. Going into your 4th year, teams decide to go pick the 5th year option. Now, clearly, I'm sure Green Bay's going to keep a close eye on his development throughout practice and etc. And if they feel like he's progressing and they pick up that 5th year option, then maybe that's them basically saying, okay, so maybe after that 2-year period, we look at this team, look at maybe where things are and say, okay, maybe we need to go ahead and start thinking about putting Jordan Love in there. And then maybe you talk to Rodgers about potentially moving on to the other team. And listen, we also don't know how long Rodgers is planning on playing. We see quarterbacks like Drew Brees and Brett Favre and Tom Brady playing into their 40s. To me, a guy like Aaron Rodgers, he doesn't come off as a guy who would want to play into his 40s, but he could. He could play into his 40s. But I feel like he's a guy who may sit here and say, maybe I should move on. And don't forget something about Aaron Rodgers, too. In his situation, when he was drafted, he didn't play early when he was drafted by Green Bay. It took a couple of years for him to hit the field. So it's not like, getting drafted means you're going to always play right away. And I think that's the situation Jordan Love's in. But overall, I think Rodgers just feels like, okay, I need to make sure that y'all are committed to winning now. We're committed to trying to get back to the NFC Championship game and win. And I think he's committed. And listen, like I've said before, Green Bay, especially if they lose Aaron Jones, I think if they're going to lose a running back, they need to upgrade at second wideout. You do have a top number one. You do have a really good tight end. But you also had a running game. Well, if you lose that running game or you lose the dynamicness of that running game, you may still be able to have a good running game. But, you don't want to feel like we lost a player, but we're not going to upgrade the rest of the offense. They're getting David Bakhtiari back next year. Like I said, in the NFC Championship game was the first game that you really looked at that game and said, they missed him. And so, with this receiver class being deep again this year, maybe you look at, if you're a Green Bay fan, and think, okay, we definitely should maybe go for a wide receiver this year. Obviously, again, it doesn't have to be your first round pick or anything of the sort, but maybe top 3 rounds, like, okay, let's get a wide receiver, get maybe a speed guy, maybe get a big play guy, you know what I'm saying? Somebody like that who you could bring into there and, make some big plays over the top for Aaron Rodgers if you're going to, maybe not be as dynamic in the run game and etc. So, those are some options to potentially look into. Also, a pass rusher. You watch that Tampa game. They couldn't get after Brady that well unless they blitzed. So, definitely, if you're Green Bay, you look into a pass rusher. Try to get somebody in there to be on the other side and get after the quarterback. So, all that's something they got to consider. But they basically, at the end of the day, have to prove to Rodgers that they're committed to basically winning. Like, listen. Future's still 2-3 years away. What about now? What about me in my prime? What about now while we can still compete? What are you willing to do for this team? So it's definitely understandable why Rodgers feels the way he feels. And it'll be interesting to see what moves Green Bay makes this offseason to maybe try to appease their quarterback. But that's all the time we have here for this segment. Coming up next, we're going to get into the Rams quarterback situation. You don't want to miss out on this. Stay tuned.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red-hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's gsmcpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Football Podcast. Last segment, we discussed Aaron Rodgers, why he may feel a little slighted, a little disrespected in Green Bay, why he made the comments he made. I talked about why he feels that way, what Green Bay needs to prove to him this offseason, and some of the things they can do to improve to him this offseason, that they're still committed to winning right now, because that's what Aaron Rodgers wants at the end of the day, the ability to win games. And before we get into our next topic, I would like to remind all of you to follow the GSMC Twitter for football. That is GSMC_football. That is GSMC_football. So, about a week and a half ago, I reported, or I talked about how the Rams, Sean McVay, and Jared Goff had a bit of a strained relationship. It wasn't great at the moment. They needed some marriage counseling, as the report said. And now today we have gotten basically a bombshell coming out of LA, where they're basically saying that it's going to be an open quarterback competition this next training camp between Jared Goff and John Wolford. If you remember, John Wolford played the last game of the regular season, played decent. He didn't play bad. He played decent. He's obviously a really good runner, really good, with his legs. And apparently that impressed the Rams enough to where they're like, hey, we may want to open this up. We may want to go for another quarterback here. And I think what shocks everybody is that the Rams just paid Jared Goff 2 years ago. They just gave him a new deal. And yet you're now talking about coming off a playoff year, off a divisional round loss. You're talking about potentially having Jared Goff not even play. And let me say something. Jared Goff didn't really play that bad in the playoffs. He came in there hurt, and he played as well as he could. He played better in the divisional round game than the wild card. And I guess because of the strained relationship between Sean McVay and Jared Goff, Sean McVay has said, you know what, I kind of like the guy behind him. Remember, Jared Goff was rubbed the wrong way when he did not start the wild card game, and John Wolford did. That rubbed Goff the wrong way. And now you're trying to tell Goff, hey, the job's just not automatically yours. You got to win it from the backup quarterback. You have to understand. To say something like that, I would not be surprised if in the next week Jared Goff requests a trade. I would not be shocked if he decided to request a trade, because he probably feels like wow, like, so after everything, the playoff appearances, everything that's happened. Yes, Jared Goff has been up and down. Yes, Jared Goff has struggled, but he is still a good quarterback. And you're telling me that I have to win my job from the backup quarterback. And I think that, honestly, this honestly could just be the Rams honestly just going out of their way and low-key telling everybody, listen, if you want Jared Goff, you can have him. And so that's interesting to me, the story of this offseason, especially, and I'm gonna bring San Francisco into this too. How you have two quarterbacks in Jimmy G and Jared Goff, both led their teams to Super Bowls. You can make an argument if they were a big deal, if they were a big part of it or not. But they both got the Super Bowls, and yet now, in the same offseason, their teams are now like, hey, we'll move off of them. Remember, Les Snead in the press conference didn't necessarily even sit here and give Jared Goff the commitment that he's going to be here. He kept saying, for right now, Jared Goff is a member of the LA Rams. And I always say, when a team says right now, that means, listen, we are open to potentially moving him, but as far as we know at the second, he will be with us. And so you got Les Snead saying that. Now you're talking about an open quarterback competition. I think Jared Goff may come out and say, trade me then. I'm not going to sit here, come back to camp, basically now knowing my coach isn't behind me, the general manager may not be behind me, and y'all may have already some favoritism towards the backup quarterback, y'all might as well just trade me. If you don't want me to be the quarterback, just get rid of me. Why keep me hostage? Why keep me here if you don't even want me here? You know, you gotta think about it. You just paid Jared Goff a big deal 2 years ago. You made the commitment to Goff. After that Super Bowl, you are our guy. And then you came back and then said 2 years later, you know what, Jared Goff, you're not our guy. we actually like the backup quarterback. And I think, like I said, if Jared Goff is angry, he deserves to be. Now, this obviously opens up the door. Where would Jared Goff go? Again, Jared Goff isn't an elite quarterback by any stretch of the imagination, but he's a good quarterback. You can win games with Goff. You can win games with him. But obviously, he has to be, and listen, he has been with Sean McVay, so we have to think about, okay, he was in a really good offensive system, and he still was able to win games. So obviously, you don't want to be a team that's challenged offensively and say, hey, Jared Goff, we want you to be good here. One team I think you need to look out for, potentially in all of this, maybe could be Chicago. Now, I understand the Goff, Chicago, don't feel like that works, that fits. But remember, Matt Nagy, a lot of people think Matt Nagy isn't a good coach. A lot of people, even people within I know have said, I don't think Matt Nagy has been exposed. He's not able to be as creative as he was that first year. The offense hasn't been the same. That's why he gave up play calling duties. But Matt Nagy is supposed to be a very innovative, smart offensive mind. Maybe he's willing to sit here and say, you know something? Jared Goff's won in this league. He's played very well in this league. Maybe I can look into bringing in a Jared Goff potentially and just doing that one. You know, experimenting with him. Hey, you could do a position battle with Mitchell Trubisky and Jared Goff if you want. Listen, I know it's not the most ideal quarterback situation for the Bears, but that may be the best you can get. Maybe could you see a New England? A New England could get in that. If they can't get one of the better quarterbacks like a Stafford, Deshaun Watson, could they look into maybe getting a Jared Goff? I think that actually might be a really good match for Goff. Because you know one thing about the Patriots is that I'm sure they're aware of what Jared Goff is and his strengths and weaknesses. And they're not usually a team that tries to put their players in worse and bad spots. You know they're going to try to reaffirm a running game. They think that, hey, we have a really good, we were going to get a lot of our defensive starters back. We were still a top 10 defense. If we can improve the weapons and we maybe bring in a Jared Goff, we may be right back in the playoffs next year competing for a championship potentially. They may feel like that. Bill Belichick may sit here and say, hey, what about a Jared Goff? Is that somebody we can look into bringing in potentially? That's something I think you have to definitely consider if you're them. You know, and I think you can't rule it out. You can't sit here and say no. You know, I mean, you could even have a very unlikely scenario. Could you see a swap of Jimmy G and Jared Goff? Maybe Sean McVay says, I like Jimmy Garoppolo. I think he'll do well in my offense. And then they'll say, we'll give you Goff. And then, you know, Kyle Shanahan can say, you know what? I think Goff will work in my offense a little better. Yeah, I mean, you don't know. You never know. I mean, that could be something that could be discussed right there. And so, you know, that I just think it's surprising that the Rams have just backpedaled. And I think that's what's the most shocking thing. They have backpedaled so much off of Jared Goff as our guy to now he's a member of the Rams now. We like the backup quarterback. We want to give him a chance. It's an open competition. It just feels like you're literally sitting here and saying, yeah. And then here's the other issue too. And I have no issue with John Wolford. But realistically, you just sit here and think there's no way they really think, hey, we can still be a good team, a championship team with John Wolford at our quarterback. There's no way that they sit there and say that. Now listen, you may like him. You may say, hey, he's the guy, really good backup quarterback. We think he could be one of the better backups in the league. He can win us games. You know, we have a really good roster. They could say all of that. That could be the case. But there's no way you're sitting here, you're telling me if you're the Rams, we are comfortable going into a full 17-game schedule next year. Because we forget, I mean, as far as we know, they're supposed to add a 17th game. We'll see if they actually end up doing it. And you're going to tell me we're going to go with our backup quarterback and hope that he's still, if not just as good, better than Jared Goff. I just don't see that. I don't see it. I just don't see how you can make that move, how you can sell your fan base on that. Listen, Jared Goff has his issues. Jared Goff has his problems. We know how up and down. We know how he can be turnover prone, a turnover machine. We know John McVay called him out earlier this year for it. But I just don't think you can sit here and legitimately tell me straight in my face that you think that the bad guy you have behind him gives you a better chance to win than him. Because Jared Goff has had really good moments before. He has won games before. I mean, let's not say act like Sean McVay act like that, that you didn't need Jared Goff. You needed him. Remember, he was hot. He was a hot mess under Jeff Fisher. You came in and made him a relevant quarterback. You helped this man through his career. And now to come back, like I said, and now just basically have this non-vote of confidence, and you have this strained relationship with him. It just feels like if that's the case, it just feels like to me that eventually you're gonna have to move off of him, because there's no other way. There's no way you can keep him here and then be satisfied. It sounds like you're going to have to move off of Goff. That may be what you have to do. That may be the move right there. And so it'll be interesting to see if the Rams actually do decide to move off Jared Goff. I think Goff is a guy who, definitely, he has a big deal, so we'll have to see if they wanted to move him, the contract. We also got to look into like cap hit numbers. If they cut him before a certain date, after a date, what would the cap hit be? All of that would be important. Because this, I mean, like I said, with this type of news today, it just seems like overall you're basically heading towards a divorce. It's just a matter of somebody going out and saying, okay, yeah, either Jared Goff saying I'm leaving or the Rams saying we're looking to move on. That's what it feels like what we're doing right now. It's a waiting game. Who's going to say it first? Because it seems like that's where it's headed. So who going to say it first? So we're going to have to keep an eye on that, because it looks like the Rams, I would say now, have over a 50% chance that they'll be starting next year with a new quarterback behind center. But that's all the time we have here for this segment. Coming up next, we're going to get into some news around the NFL. So stay tuned right here on the GSMC Football Podcast.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Football Podcast. Last segment, we discussed the Rams quarterback situation. It looks like an inevitable divorce is about to happen between Jared Goff and the Rams. It just looks like that's the case. I just don't see how it's going to work, because it just feels like, what other direction could it go in? Really, like, what other direction could it go in? Because it just seems like it's inevitable at this point. And if it's inevitable at this point, then all we can really sit here and say is, I guess Jared Goff's going to end up with a new team next year. and the Rams are going in a new, fresh direction at quarterback. So, like I said, it's just a matter of when they're going to actually go out and say it, because it looks like that's what all signs are pointing to. But maybe somehow, you never know, they able to make things work. Goff still wins the job, and we'll kick off another season with Mcvay, Goff, and see what happens. So, but again, continuing on to this quarterback, just a quarterback-heavy show so far. We're going to get into Jameis Winston. Yes, Jameis Winston, famous Jameis, 30 for 30. Jameis Winston. So, we know his last full season as a starter in Tampa, he had 30 touchdowns, 30 interceptions. Tampa had a 7-9 record. And really, honestly, the fact that he has 30 interceptions, that's a big deal. Jameis Winston, he ended up going to the New Orleans Saints last year as an opportunity to learn under Sean Payton and Drew Brees and improve mentally his game. Because he has the physical traits. It was a mental thing. And everything. And I think one thing that shocked people was when Drew Brees went down, they went with Taysom Hill. Because we've been hearing for the longest time that Sean Payton loves Taysom Hill. He wants Taysom Hill to be the guy for the team moving forward. And then some people think the Saints could be rebuilding this offseason because of all of the just being so deep into the cap. They're going to have to get rid of a lot of players. So they may not be as good as a roster next year. And so that's going to really, make things interesting. And Jameis is a free agent, so it's not even like he's going to be guaranteed to be back with the Saints next year either. Another team could go after Jameis and say, you know what, Jameis, we'll pay you more. We may guarantee you a spot or a more guaranteed spot as our starting quarterback. But reportedly, the Saints are intrigued by Jameis. And that is something that is extremely interesting to see and hear. Because I think everybody, even remember when Taysom Hill started last year? Let me go with that. And there were reports that Saints fans were kind of like, why are we not starting Jameis? And players were even reportedly like, well, why are we not starting Jameis? Because, let's be honest, he's the quarterback on that roster. If you look at talent, you would think, well, he's the second best quarterback on this roster. But they went with Taysom. And let's not forget something, because there's an underrated subject to all of this that we haven't discussed. Taysom Hill signed a new deal before last year. His cap hit this year is $16 million. If you don't have him starting and you're taking a $60 million cap hit for him, that's risky, especially with your cap situation the way it is. And so they may be looking into saying, hey, we may have to go with Jameis. And I think a lot of people, regardless of how you feel about Jameis, I think out of the two guys, I'm sure you sit here and say, I think Jameis would be the better option. I've said that if Jameis started that playoff game, they would have a better chance to beat Tampa, because you could only do short stuff, time routes, flats, or less slants. You could only do that for so long. You have to start opening it up. Give the defense a threat of going down the field. That's why I think when the Saints get to the playoffs, they've failed each and every time, because they've literally always had top 5 rosters. So roster-wise, they're always going to be in the game. They can almost sometimes beat teams just because they just have a better roster than you. But when you face a team that's roster is just an equivalent to the Saints, you notice in those matchups, that's when the quarterback begins to shine. Remember, Minnesota, just a year ago, if you look at that Minnesota team then, their roster was just as good as the Saints. Just as good. And who played better, Kirk Cousins or Drew Brees? Kirk Cousins. You could literally, it is crazy to say this, but you can't sit here and tell me that you thought Drew Brees was better than Kirk Cousins at that minute. You got a guy who has to deke and dunk, and at least Kirk Cousins could go. If Kirk Cousins is on, we know Kirk Cousins can light it up. I mean, legitimately. You have situations where Brees not being able to stretch the field has hurt them because the defense knows what you're going to do. They're just as talented as you. And in the case with Tampa Bay, they've played you twice already. Michael Thomas is hurt. I mean, offensively, it seemed like it was going to be a struggle for the Saints. And it was. And their defense could only do so much, but Tampa Bay's offense started to play better. And so I felt like Jameis would have been better because Jameis has shown the ability. With those weapons that New Orleans has, Jameis, to me, could average 30 a point game with that offense. With his talent, his ability to stretch the field. It opens up the playbook. And so, to me, I've always thought that Jameis would be the better option here. Because Sean Payton has even said, our quarterback next year is in the house right now. He is currently on this team. The Saints don't have no cap. They don't have really, I mean, you could draft the guy, but you only got 4 picks. You're really not going to draft a quarterback, especially since you're not going to get a top quarterback with one of those picks. Because any quarterback you draft would still probably be still on the bench anyway. And listen, they could still go that route. They could draft a guy second, third, or whatever, whenever the rounds that actually have picks in are. They're about to get some picks. They're about to get some third round picks, I think, because Atlanta got Terry Fournette. And if you get a minority coach that was developed within the team and then goes to another team, that team that developed him get picks. So they're going to get some picks. But still, listen, you may be able to get a Dak Prescott situation or a Russell Wilson situation. But you ain't about to sit here and tell me he's going to be starting for you week 1. So you're going to probably go who you got. You're paying Taysom Hill a good amount of money. And that's why I think if they are able to re-sign Jameis Winston, the key to that situation will be this. What will the numbers look like? Remember, if a team's bringing you in to start, you automatically could get 10 plus million. Just because that seems like that's just regular starting quarterback money. You're not going to come in there, make $6-7 million a year, and then say, okay, prove yourself. It's literally you coming in there and proving, already getting paid like $15 million if you could start. They may sign you to a 1-year deal, but hey, it's a deal. And so, Jameis, to me, I think learning from Drew Brees, learning from Sean Payton, I think he has improved mentally. And that is going to be what helps him. And then I also say this about Sean Payton. With his offensive genius, he's not going to put Jameis in a situation like he did with Bruce Arians. Remember, Bruce Arians' offense is kind of risk it biscuit offense. You kind of got to throw it up for grabs a few times in the offense. That's why Brady has more interceptions than he has in most years. Because that's the kind of offense. And so when you have a guy like Jameis who can be erratic, and then the offense is saying you're going to have to take chances, well, yeah, a lot of interceptions are going to happen. But overall, I think when you look at it, I think the Saints are not going to run an offense that says, all right, Jameis, put it up for grabs. He's going to try to run an offense that still gets receivers open. It makes the throws easier for Jameis. Because that's one thing I feel like I see when I watch Saints offenses. The system is designed to help receivers get open, to make the throws easier on Drew Brees, with his accuracy be able to make good throws, and then you go from there. I think Jameis can thrive in an offense like that. Because it's not like that the Saints don't got weapons. You got Michael Thomas. You got Harris. You got Emmanuel Sanders. You got Jared Cook. So there's plenty. You got Alvin Kamara. if you became a running football team, I think Jameis would be great with the play action. And so overall, I look at it and say to myself, really, this team on paper is still going to be stacked offensively next year. Again, depending on the moves they make, this offseason. They're going to have to restructure a lot of deals. They're going to have to cut some guys. They're still waiting on Drew Brees and what his final decision is going to be. Like I said, everybody, players, front office, I think everybody expects Drew Brees to not come back. And then the question is, if Drew Brees decides to come back, what do you do if you're Sean Payton and Mickey Loomis? Because you're kind of like, Drew, if we're trying to compete next year, we may not be able to keep you. So I feel like in this situation, it's one of those things where I truly just think Drew is just taking some time to just, relax, hang with his family, and really just get his mind clear. And then he'll come out and announce his retirement. Because, I feel like some players don't want to get rushed into making a decision. That's why sometimes I always say some players already know what they're going to do, but they don't want to be rushed into going ahead and doing it. They want to be able to do it when they're ready to do it. Like, you may know I'm retiring. Some guys, they could just say, yeah, after the game, I'm done. Some guys, let me give myself about 2-3 weeks, then come back and say I'm done. Some guys, it may be a couple of months, then say I'm done. That's just how it is. That's how everybody does it. You're not always going to get that immediate retirement. I think Drew Brees will retire, and I think if the Saints can bring back Jameis Winston, I really think they need to look at him being a starting quarterback. And the thing is that with the kind of roster that you may have next year, remember, you may be able to win with Taysom Hill with the roster you had this year. But what if you lose a wide receiver, some offensive linemen, some defensive players? Can you still feel as confident with Taysom Hill behind center? So that's just my take on the quarterback situation in New Orleans. But that's all the time we have here. Coming up next, we're going to get through some news and rumors around the NFL. So stay tuned right here on the GSMC Football Podcast.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Football Podcast. Last segment we discussed Jameis Winston in New Orleans. The Saints are intrigued by potentially making Jameis Winston the starting quarterback next year, as they're looking to have to resign him to a deal. And I basically gave a case last segment why I think he should be the starting quarterback of the New Orleans Saints. Why I think that would be a good move in terms of New Orleans Saints. And basically just overall, we just feel really good about, to me, I think Jameis was the best chance for the win last year. I think this year he's the best person for the win this year as well. Again, this isn't about me not supporting Taysom Hill. It's just, I can see it with, if you've had the rosters you had the last few years, your roster is going to look a bit different this year with all the cap casualties that you're going to have to make. So are you really still trusting a guy like Taysom Hill in that type of potential situation to still be as good as he's been? Or do you want to potentially say, hey, maybe this year Taysom being a gadget player could be even more important because we're about to lose some guys. We may need some help at other positions. So that's just my thoughts on that. And now we're going to get into some news around the league. And first, we're going to get back into some Matthew Stafford news. Obviously, as you know, the Lions and Matthew Stafford have agreed to go separate ways. They're going to look to trade Matthew Stafford to a team and give him a new, fresh start. So reportedly, the starting compensation is that the Lions are expected to get at least one first-round pick for him. At least one. So, if you had to rank Rodgers, Deshaun, and Matthew would probably cost you the least, I would think. Because remember, this is one thing that's going to help Matthew Stafford. He has a very team-friendly deal. I think it's only 2 years, $43 million left. That's about 21.5 a year. That's a bargain with starting quarterback prices nowadays. And you see what quarterbacks are getting paid. It's a team-friendly deal. It's only 2 years left. So, legitimately, this is a really good contract. You're getting a very talented quarterback. And, let's think about the Colts, who are in a win-now situation. Sometimes with these rosters that you feel like you've accumulated that are, great rosters, you're not always going to be able to keep your roster. So you sometimes got to make tough decisions. Having a quarterback on the price that you would have Matthew Stafford on for those next 2 years could help you still be able to help that roster be good. And then after 2 years, let's say you got some big names coming up in 2 years. If you're ready to maybe go on to Jacob Eason, who they drafted this past year, people forget about him. Maybe they say, hey, let's give Jacob Eason a chance. He's still in his rookie deal. We still have a decent roster. We can bring back some guys because of that. You can make that move. Also, he doesn't have a huge cap hit. So maybe, let's say Stafford doesn't work after the first year. Maybe the Colts say, hey, we can move off of him. That's just an example. And so I'm sure there's going to be teams that look into it, say, okay, what do we need to give up to acquire a guy like Matthew Stafford? Teams have reached out already to inquire. I'm sure, right? I honestly, out of all the quarterback moves, Matthew Stafford could be the first one that's made, just because it seems like the cleanest and easiest deal to make in terms of it's more likely that move will be made quicker because there's more of an aggression to shop Matthew Stafford. Plus, it's not like you're having to give up a king's ransom for Matthew Stafford, so you're going to have to really dig down deep and ask your organization, do we make this? See, Deshaun Watson, I could see that taking a minute because teams have to sit here and say, okay, are we going to give up what we have? Because remember, the draft is in April. It's January. Teams don't have to make any moves right now. And remember, none of the trades would become official till the new league year in March. So I wouldn't be surprised if maybe we got a little bit closer to that. That's when you maybe may see some movement with Deshaun Watson and the trade talks actually getting somewhere. Because remember, Dolphins can't say anything. No team can really say anything because of tampering. So we don't truly know who is truly going to make that move. And like I said, Miami, we know the debate. Some people think stick with Tua, build around him, give him a chance. Some people think, the Jets, it honestly depends if they think Sam Darnold is the right guy for the job. If not, make that move. It's just a big decision that has to be made. So I think Matthew Stafford will be the first domino to fall. And I think that could be a base. Let's say that Detroit was able to get a first, a third, or a fourth, and that was pretty much it. Then it's like, okay, so if they got a first and a fourth for Matthew Stafford, then Houston could come back and say, okay, well, we think Deshaun Watson is 2 times a better player, so that's why they have their base at 3 first-round picks. And maybe it justifies everything they think about Deshaun. And like I said, with potentially Jimmy G being on the market, Jared Goff being on the market, that could be big. That could mean a lot. And there's going to be a lot of quarterbacks out there and a lot of teams looking for them. So it's going to be interesting to see how it all works out, how it all turns out, and just how it just continues to move on. So we're going to have to keep an eye on Matthew Stafford. Like I said, I think he'll be the first quarterback moved. And everything works out. So, Houston Texans have hired David Culley as their new head coach. They have found their guy. Baltimore Ravens assistant head coach has reportedly accepted the Houston Texans offer. So, and he's also bringing Tim Kelly with him. Or keeping him, basically. And so now I think with the moves that have been made by Houston, I think clearly there's going to be a fresh start. There's going to be clearly a new regime, a new start. And listen, I've said this about Houston. I've been critical of Houston. They have to reset things. They have to look at themselves in the mirror and reset. They have to change because you are now looked at as the worst franchise in the NFL by players. Not because you lost. You haven't really been a losing team since Deshaun's been there. It's not because of that. It's because of how your organization has been ran, the decisions that have been made, the disrespect of the players. You've made yourself a very undesirable free agent destination. Players don't want to play for you. Your star quarterback wants to leave because of all of those issues. And so you're going to have to make a restart. Now, think about who they hired. Nick Caserio from the New England Patriots, one of the best coaches in football. Now David Coley from Baltimore, one of the best coaches in football. They've hired two people who came from amazing cultures. So from a culture perspective, you would probably think the culture would be better within Houston. Because this should be a wake-up call for Houston, what's happening with Deshaun Watson, and make them want to change. Now, in this situation, you're going... I think one thing that also maybe looks bad for Houston here is, remember last week we were hearing that Eric Bellamy and Leslie Frazier were favorites. They really liked him. And then it's just like, now they come back, they have one interview with the assistant head coach of Baltimore, and now they worked fast and made him head coach. And it makes you kind of sit here and wonder, did they interview and consider Leslie and Eric Bellamy just because they wanted to maybe make that one last plea to Deshaun Watson? See, we care about what you say, please stay. And then when they heard he wasn't going to stay, they said, well, screw it. We're just going to get who we want. Because like I said, they had to make a franchise decision. And listen, I think at this point, it just feels like Deshaun Watson has played his last snaps in Houston. And I'm sure the new head coach is going to want to talk to Houston. I'm sure Coley is going to want to talk to Deshaun. We've heard that Deshaun has not been returning phone calls, so we don't know if that's going to change. But we know that he probably wants to talk to Deshaun. I mean, he should. Hey, I got to at least try to talk to the guy and see what happens. But I think we have learned from this situation that overall, Houston did this to themselves. And they're going to have to rely on David Coley and Nick Caserio to completely flip this roster. They have to basically start from scratch. They could be the Miami Dolphins of 2 years ago, where you just tear it all down. You get, you get rid of your quarterback, you tear it all down, get rid of every player you have that's a value. Get draft picks for them, collect picks, free up money because you're already over the cap. It just, you take your lumps in your first year, but you're creating a new culture. You're creating a new environment. Players like to play in this environment. If you see improvement with Houston throughout the season with a less than talented roster, that's something that you can put your head on and say, okay, now next year comes. All the picks you accumulate with Deshaun Watson trade or other players, freeing up cap space. You can now sit here and say, okay, now we can get the players we want in here. We can get the picks, the free agents we want in here. We have flexibility with what we want to do with our team. Because like I've said, Houston's going to have to go through an entire makeover. They're going to have to go through an entire switchover. They can't just stick to what they've been doing and just say that is acceptable. You just can't do it. So they're going to have to stick to it. They're going to have to run with it. And they're going to have to just try their best to really fix the mess they've created. Because, like I said, this situation is their fault. They put themselves in this position. Now they have to fix it. Deshaun Watson will more than likely, most definitely be out the door. And listen, it may be the end of an era, of the Deshaun Watson era in Houston, but you can start a new era, start anew, start fresh, get better players, get draft picks, change this team, go into the 2020s and be able to reverse everything. So, it's not the end of the world for Houston. But that's all the time we have here for this segment. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Football Podcast. I've had a great time being able to, provide my insight on the NFL and college football with you guys. And like I always say when I end the podcast, don't forget to listen to other amazing podcasts here at the GSMC Podcast Network. This is your host, Brice, signing out, saying have a good day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.